Hello, welcome back to the Queen City Guitar Shop. So today I've got the back and the top on this guitar. Everything is flushed up, the sides are cleaned up, and I've got a coat of glue size across the entire outside just to stiffen up the wood fibers so you can get cleaner cuts. And it is now time to cut the binding and purfling channels. I've done this a number of different ways. I've done it with a router in a jig so that the router is stationary and the guitar sits on a cradle and you spin it around to cut the channels. I've done it with a router and a sort of setup that references the sides to cut the channels and you move the router around the guitar. I've done it with a Dremel and a similar setup. I've even modified the Dremel setup to make it more stable and more accurate. But most of the guitars I've built I've done by hand, mainly with these, just a pair of Gramils. You could get by with one, two makes it easier. The Gramil is basically just a fancy marking gauge. It's definitely a slower process than going with a router, but I definitely prefer hand tools whenever I can use them. I like the process. And you get a very clean and a very accurate channel without generally any need to go back and file away irregularities. There's no chip out potential, and I just find it to be a more enjoyable process, and I think that I often tend to turn to hand tools, and this process is no different. I think you get better at the things you practice, and I would like to get better at using hand tools. So while it's a slower process, it's one I enjoy a lot more. So talking about the Gramils, like I said, they're basically a marking gauge, but a little bit unique in that a lot of the marking gauges have pins and some of them have blades, and these Gramils have a blade that's similar to a marking knife. It's got a flat back and it has two bevels on the same side of the blade, so that you can cut in either direction, and on the back side of the blade you're going to leave a really crisp, clean line, a real crisp shoulder. Unlike a marking gauge, the body of these has got a flat registration surface and then also a curved registration surface, and so we can flip those around. The curve is going to be important to cut the channels in the waist. And we also have a collar that slips onto the shaft of these and allows us to set a depth of cut and lock it in and then move the body around. For instance, if I want to flip it around to get into the waist, then this is going to mechanically remember the depth so I don't have to go back and remeasure it. Or when I cut these, I'm going to make small cuts and step to the full size of the channel. So for instance, I have a Gramil that cuts this like depth of the binding, and the second Gramil is going to cut the shelf into the guitar in this direction. And so this one that's cutting this direction, I'm going to make a mark for the total desired depth, and then I'm going to basically slide the body closer to the blade and cut smaller shelves off as I go, and in that way I can accurately move down to that line without having to do really any work with the chisel. The only thing I'm going to use the chisel for is after I set the initial cut, I'm going to use the chisel to remove a little bit of waste material between these two lines, and that is going to facilitate easier cutting with the Gramils. The Gramils are really going to do all the work, and so they're going to define the crisp, clean lines of the channel. So the first step is going to be cutting the binding. I'll cut this in two stages. It's going to be binding, and then when the binding's done, I'm going to cut the purfling channel. They're very similar processes. For the binding, the first thing we want to do is decide which gramil is going to make this cut and which is going to make this cut. And then you simply want to set it a little bit shorter than the binding is tall. Okay, so once that is set, and again this is going to be the gramil that cuts the depth, so it needs to be, you know, set for that on there. I'm going to set this collar on, and the collar is going to be the tool's memory about how deep this needs to be. And the collar is not going to move until this channel is completely cut, this binding channel is completely cut. If your back and your top bindings are the same, and they generally are, you're going to want to cut the back and the top fully bindings channel-wise, and then move on to purfling so that you don't have to reset this. So one trick to set these exactly, which I find is helpful in setting the depth in this direction, where I'm less concerned about having a little overhang, is to basically set the blade depth the same as it is for, you know, basically to use the blade to squeeze the binding between the body and the blade and lock it in at that depth. And then remove the actual blade, because I need to account for the width of the blade between the back edge and the flat edge, because of course the flat side of the blade is going to be out. So to do that, I can basically lock this collar in place against the body, against the back side of the body, and then I can loosen up the body, slide it forward, take the blade, register it between the collar that I locked down a second ago and the body, tighten it back up, work my blade loose, move the collar back up, put the blade back in, again bevel facing in, and now I have the width of the binding between the blade and the body, between the flat edge of the blade that's going to create our actual shoulder and the binding, and that should be perfect, and it didn't require any eyeballing. You can just put it in and manipulate the gramil to get the right distance without a lot of fuss. So the next step, I'm going to trace, I'm going to use the gramils to cut the circle, to cut all the shelves in like I was marking them. I don't need to go deep, I just need them to be there so I can see them. I will generally then rub some fine ebony dust or some chalk into the lines so that I can really see them well. I'm going to put it in my handy vise. I'm going to use the chisel really quick to basically just cut as close to this line and as close to this line as I can, but they don't have to be right on, but just remove wood so that there's some relief, because that relief will allow these gramils to cut away the material much easier than if they were, you know, blade, wood, body, with no movement space for the wood itself. With a little movement space for the wood, you get the cutting action. The cutting action just becomes a lot easier. But this isn't a super accurate. It doesn't need to be cutting a ton of material away. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it. It's just simply removing waste material, wood that is in the way. I'm going to remove that, and then I'm going to start cutting the channels down with the Gramil. So we'll pick up the video again when I get to that point. It's important to note that with the Gramils it's less important, but I still do this. But with the chisel it's very important to always work from the flat of the grain. And with the Gramil, the size it doesn't matter at all. But when you're marking the lines and cutting from the top or the back, it's good to follow from like the top of the grain and work downhill. Just like if you imagine planing across grain like this, you would want to plane this direction. If you try and work this way, you're going to run into some trouble, especially chiseling, where it's going to be possible to get split out and have bad things happen that will telegraph into what's going to not be waste material. So that's just a note. I'm going to go ahead and get that started, and I will see you when I'm done with that. Okay, so I've got all of these channels relieved and ready to actually cut the channel itself, the shoulders of the channel. As a quick note, I put some tape on this Gramil. This is the Gramil that's going to cut the bottom shoulder, and since the top and the back are both radiused on this guitar and on all the guitars I build, I want to compensate for that so that I can get as close to a square shoulder between the side and this shoulder as I can. If that angle is off, it could show up in gaps. It could make gluing the binding up wonky. Second note, I predominantly use the chisel when I'm removing wood in preparation for using the Gramils. It's versatile, it can get in everywhere. It's comfortable to use. There are times when you're cutting the side material away and the top of the back where you'll run out in the side material and it'll want to splinter in the direction that you want to chisel, where it's convenient to chisel in, and that can be a problem, and it can be helpful in those circumstances to use spoke shaves or like a finger plane. I've got a flat-soled spoke shave and a round-soled. For this guitar, the round-soled is still not round enough to get into this tight waist, but for like a dreadnought, I'm sure it would. And if you're going to use these, just like the chisel, it's important to keep it angled. You're trying to bridge the line for the shoulder on this side and the line for the shoulder on this side. Once that's relieved, then we can start defining the shoulders and cutting the actual channel out, making it look like an actual channel with the Gramils. So this is the Gramil that I'm going to use to cut the shoulder into the side shoulder. This Gramil we're going to use to step down the channel slowly. So the collar is going to remain, so we always have this accurate depth cut. And I'm going to simply make it so it's making much less of a cut. Now, I'm going to do that with the wrong bolt. It's important to pay attention to which thing you're loosening up. So for this one, this first cut, since I'm purfling both sides, I'm going to make this first cut be the depth that I anticipate wanting to make the purfling, which is an important consideration. And that depth is basically going to be the width of the blade. I think it's a little bit more than a millimeter. It's probably like 1.5 millimeters. And this way, generally getting the channel carved out of the back and the top before you hit the side is the most difficult. Once you work through the back and the top and you're working on the sides, then cutting these sections out as you work down is going to be a lot easier. But for this it's going to be a little more challenging And so it's nice to know that I'm going to be cutting the same depth as the purfling, because when I'm making this cut, it's going to be helpful to put a little more pressure on the blade. And if I cut through the actual depth that if I cut through the actual binding channel basically, then it's good to know that that knife cut into the back or the top is going to just continue on into the purfling rather than being below the purfling channel where it's going to serve to weaken. When you're doing these channels, it's best to think that if the surface behind the blade that it's cutting towards is going to be a finished surface, that you should have a really light hand so that you're not going to leave any cuts in the wood underneath. But as I'm working down the binding channel, for instance, this gramil is not going to come anywhere near a finished shoulder until I get to the last step. And so up until that point, I can be a little bit more heavy-handed with this cut, because if I go past where I'm going, where I intend to go on each step, I'm going to basically take this channel down in 4 steps, increasing the depth on this gramil every time. And so until I get to that last step, then anything I cut into is just going to get cut away, and so it doesn't matter. When I get to that last section of waste material, I'm going to be really light-handed on both ones, but since it's going to be cutting into sides and lining that are all grain, long grain in the same direction, it's going to be really a lot easier to cut out, and so I can get away with having a really light touch and just sort of working the cuts towards each other until I can just break it out. So I'm going to get started on this. I'm probably going to let this run for a few so you can get an idea of what I'm doing, and we'll check in when I'm a little further along. So as I start cutting this binding channel, I am only cutting through the back here, and so the way the gramil cuts is going to change as I go around, whether I'm cutting through end grain or long grain. And I'm only cutting the shelf, like I said, about 1.5 millimeters deep. So it's not going to be very much. It's probably 2 millimeters is about as much as you want to start cutting, just to get a feel for it. Obviously I suggested to cut the depth of the purfling, but as you continue to work down, once you get this first section of the channel cut away, you don't want to try and make too big of a cut afterwards. So I'm going to work back and forth with the 2 gramils, cutting in on one side and then cutting in from the other, to try and bring those 2 cuts together. On the long grain on the back here, for instance, you'll notice that it wants to come away in larger strips, and then when you're cutting through the back or the top and the end grain, you'll notice it kind of pops out in little tiny segments especially on the top, it'll be like little segments of yearly growth. And the next step down, once I finish this section, I'm probably going to go to the other side of the glue line, so that I'm actually cutting with this Gramil. You see here, I'd actually be cutting into the side, and then I would still be cutting through the back or the top when I'm working with the other Gramil. And that'll be the second most difficult cut that you make. After that, you're mostly cutting through sides and lining, and it'll go really quickly, and you'll notice the cut doesn't change. You're always cutting the same grain, so you won't notice a big difference in cutting the heel and the tail block section versus cutting the outside edges of the bout. It's good to go slow through all of these as you get used to the process, just to get a feel for how the wood cuts, and yeah, to get a sense of how hard you need to press to get through and how hard is too hard to press. That's especially going to be important when you get to the final shoulder cuts, because you don't want to press through into wood that you're going to leave. And so I'm going to continue this down, as I said. I think for this guitar I ended up doing about 5 layers, 5 different passes, just because the bindings and the Purfling lamination are a pretty tall stack. It's good to take more passes. It'll end up going faster because you'll struggle less with each one. So you could even do 6 passes, 7 passes. It's going to partially depend on the wood that you're trying to cut as well. And the last pass that I make on this binding channel, but also on the Purfling channel, I'm going to do a very thin strip, because I want it to go very easily. I want to be able to get those 2 cuts from either direction to join up without having to use a lot of force. I mostly just want to be able to glide the Gramil across the wood and have it make the cut I need, and in that way I can keep from cutting through too far. Okay, so I have the binding channels done on this guitar, front and back, and now it's going to be time to do the Purfling channels. The Purfling for this guitar is the same front and back, so that's nice. It is really wide though, so I'm going to have to be real careful, and it's going to take me a minute. It's going to take several passes. But the first step to getting started on that is going to be to accurately set the width that I want it to go in. So I need to have the shoulder for the Purfling that's cut in to the top and the back. It needs to incorporate the width of both the binding and the Purfling. And I'd set this channel to be exactly the thickness of the binding when I set up this Gramil. And you can't really see it, but it is in fact exactly the thickness. So the easy way to set this up is going to be to loosen the collar. On this Gramil, and simply take this stack of Purfling that I'm going to want, fit it between the body and the collar, and then tighten it down. Oh. Helps to get it on there and then not to loosen it right away. I'm just going to tighten it on. It should be pretty tight to get the Purfling back out. And at that point, make sure it's the right Gramil before you loosen this up, because then it's all gone. I can push this back to the collar, and now I have the width of my Purfling and of the binding, and I can go ahead and mark that line all the way around. with this line, because it's going to be your final inside shoulder, it's important to go slow, mark it real lightly, be cognizant of the fact that it's good to have this blade retracted back further, so just a little bit sticking out, so that this doesn't wobble at all. Because whatever you mark is going to be really hard to get rid of. So you want that to be exactly the shoulder you want. I think it's generally a good practice, and this is what I do, to start everything from the back. The back is more difficult to cut, but it's less critical, so it's a good practice place. And you know, cutting these binding channels, you know, I did the back first, and then moving to the top is remarkably easier to do and much less frustrating. It's always nice to go for more. I feel like at the beginning you have more capacity, and at the end it's nice to start to end with the easier thing. And the other thing to note is that when doing any of these things, when you cut the binding channels, you're obviously working this way, and when we cut the purfling channels, we'll be working this way. It's best to take more passes rather than fewer passes, because it'll be faster in the long run, it'll be easier, you'll end up with a much less frustrating experience. And if you just take like an extra pass and don't try and save time that way, it'll go much easier. With this binding, it's pretty tall. If you can see, it's got a pretty thick lamination onto the bottom. So it actually was easiest to do five separate passes working down on the binding ledge, and that made the whole thing a lot easier than trying to take it down in 4, which is what I would normally do. So I'm going to get started on this purfling ledge. After I mark off the shoulder, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the chisel or the spoke shave, you know, with various tools to relieve a little bit of wood so that that'll cut easier when I go to the gramils. So I will see you when that's a little further along. So I wanted to pause here. I'm just about to make the final pass on this purfling ledge. And so I wanted to show you, when I talk about being patient and making sure that you're taking small cuts, I kind of wanted to show you what I'm talking about. This is going to be, this last pass on the purfling ledge is always the smallest cut that I make. As you can see, this last little bit of wood, it's about as thick as a card scraper. I actually use the card scraper to set the gramil. So on this last time around, I'm going to move this back to the collar, which is recording the depth of cut that I want, the exact depth. And I'm going to go really lightly around. I'm not going to bear down at any point. It's important on this last cut not to cut beyond the waste material. I want to use the pair of gramils to cut in from both directions and to just meet that point so that I can lift the waste material out without making any cuts beyond. I'll even use the chisel when it gets close just to see if I can loosen it a little bit and pop it out. On this guitar, I'm making a really wide purfling ledge, and so we're actually going beyond the lining. And so it's pretty important to not cut into any of the top beyond the material I want to remove. So it's important to have a lot of patience at this stage and throughout this to go slow. You'll find that if you take it slow, it'll go faster than if you get frustrated and try and cut really quickly. It's also important to have sharp gramil blades. I took a chance and didn't sharpen these before I started this guitar, and they're pretty sharp, but I can definitely feel the difference, that they're not perfectly razor sharp, having just been sharpened prior to starting this. So it's good practice to sharpen them beforehand. Another thing this wide binding ledge has brought to my attention and actually helped me to execute is a thing that I've been thinking about for a while now, which is that the gramils work really well for most of the process, but when you get to the purfling ledge, I'm cutting a channel that's as deep as the blade is, and so the blade will tend to the blade pushes the waste material directly into the body of the gramil. It doesn't leave a lot of room for lifting that and allowing, the bevel lifts the waste and allows the blade in a little bit further. And in that way you get a faster and a cleaner cut. And with a normal purfling ledge, it's not a big deal, but this one has been so wide that removing with the chisel before I start cutting material has not quite been enough, and so I made this attachment. It's just a piece of fretboard cut off that has been flattened to be even all around, and I drilled a 1/2-inch hole so it would fit over the shaft, and then cut a groove where the blade is so that it has a little bit of extra space to push the waste material. I've been meaning to do this for a while, and I finally did it. It works really well. I wouldn't want that groove in there permanently for all operations, but it's nice to have this removable piece specifically for this. So if you were to buy gramils, it would be a worthwhile modification. And if you made marking gauges or homemade gramils, it would be worthwhile to think about a way to have the ability to make a groove that was optional on this registration surface. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up. Another note is, because it's unlikely to get the binding channels cut away and then the binding and purfling bent and fit and shaped just how you want it, and then get the glue up all done in a day, I want to preserve the glue surface of these ledges without having to go back when I'm ready to glue up to sand or cut away to reveal fresh wood that is more ideal to glue to. So as soon as I finish channels for the binding and the purfling, I did the binding the other day when I finished that, I will prepare a high glue size, which I've got in my glue pot right now. It's like 6 parts water, 1 part glue. The ratio is not super important. You don't want it to be like full glue strength, but just a size to coat these channels in to try and preserve their usefulness as a glue surface, so that when I do glue the binding in, I don't need to go back and re-prep the surface for glue up, and I can get the most structurally sound joint that's possible. So that's a worthwhile note. It probably takes, this one has taken longer. This is such a wide purfling channel, and also just videoing and waiting for camera batteries to charge up, things like that. It's taken a few days. Ordinarily, it's about a half a day to do this, just for time reference. So yeah, I'm gonna finish this up, and hopefully I'll get the binding bent this afternoon or tomorrow, and everything glued up shortly thereafter. So yeah, I'll probably have a video about that as well. So we talked a lot about the gramils on the video and talked about setting them, and that was good, but it's really hard to see the gramils on the video. They're small. It's nice to have a close-up, so I thought I would do a little close-up short segment so you can see them a little better, and I can explain how I do the setup just a little bit better. So as you can see, the gramil is basically just a marking gauge, but it has this rounded back and this collar, and it's got a nice flat blade with sort of this arrow shape, single-sided bevel. So when I set them, I try not to do any measurements. I try and just use the pieces I'm going to cut to make the depth calculations. So let's say I wanted to set the cut depth for the width of this piece of purfling. I would basically want to do that. This is set a little close, so I'm going to loosen the collar up, push it out of the way. I have the the bevel facing inward, so I can take this and simply register it between the body of the gramil and the blade and lock it in place. And so now we have a cut that is the width of this piece of binding and the width of the blade. So if I want to have just the width of the binding, that's actually really simple. I can slide the collar forward and lock it in place. This is much easier when you're not standing behind a camera doing it. Can pull that out. I'm going to pull the blade out. I'm going to loosen the body up. I've got this. Sometimes you end up with a little gap. Often I notice on the Gramils, if I look really closely, it'll be touching, the collar will be touching on one side and there'll be a little gap on the other side, so that's good to pay attention to. I have no gap on the top, but a tiny gap on the bottom. So I'm going to take the blade out. I'm going to loosen the body of this. I am going to put the blade in between the body of the Gramil and the collar, and I'm going to tighten it down, and then I'm simply going to lock the collar back up against the body and put the blade back in. And now I have got this depth of cut just right on. Let's say I don't want to make this exactly the depth. Like if I was measuring the cut for the height of the binding, I would often make this proud, or sometimes I just don't. I don't want this to be exactly the same, because working a margin of error in can be good. You can also use a feeler gauge, just the same operation, to push the body forward just ever so slightly, and then I don't have to eyeball anything. I just pick a feeler gauge that's thin. It sets the offset exactly. Loosen the body, slip it between, lock it in there, loosen the collar, slip the collar forward, and now I've accounted for a small overhang. So let's say I did that, and now I want to start cutting the purfling because the binding's all done. And I want the purfling to be the exact size of the channel. That's super easy. I can simply loosen the collar, slide the purfling in, tighten the collar back up, loosen the body, slip it back, tighten that back up, and now my depth of cut is exactly the width of the channel I cut for the binding and the channel I need to cut for the purfling. And I don't have to do any measuring, no eyeballing. It's just super simple. Now I also, this is a first for me, but it's something I've been thinking about doing for a long time, made this piece of ebony, which you couldn't really see in the video, so I thought I would show you. As you can see, it's just a flat piece of ebony, came from a fingerboard, and it's got this relief cut in where the bevel is. If I'm trying to cut a purfling channel, I'm pretty much never going to want to cut wider than the blade. And as you can see, that means the bevel is pushing the waste wood directly into the body of the Gramil, which can make the cut difficult. So that relief can be really helpful in speeding things along and making the actual cuts easier, making everything go smoother. The other thing I didn't do on this yet, but that I'm considering doing, is to bring this heightened section down a little bit so that I can then cut purfling channels that are thinner than the blade. I haven't done it yet, but it would be super easy to make that happen, and I will probably do it in the future. So that's just a little bit about the Gramil, a little more in-depth look at them, and a little closer up look at what I'm doing when I set them up. Thanks for watching today. Congratulations for making it to the end of the the end of the film. It's been a long one today. If you'd like to learn more about building guitars, or you'd like to see more of my work, you can follow the link in the description below. Also check back, subscribe to my channel, or check back often. I'm probably going to be posting a video about gluing the binding into the channels in the next week or so. I just need to do the editing for it. So yeah, thanks for joining today. Hope to see you again next time. Hope you're staying safe and healthy. Have a good one.